In 86, the outline of government contracts procedure was published and updated in 94 as the infamous Green Book. And at that time it was seen as to be necessary to state that it's a basic principle of government procurement that competitive tendering should always be used unless exceptional circumstances apply, in which case the approval of the GCC must be sought. And really this was probably the beginning of the GCC intervening in construction contracts. Circular 1187 way back then dealt with the appointment of consultants in a bizarre way, possibly influenced by the perception that consultants were engaged as professional gentlemen, whereas contractors were the hired help. Hence, the negotiated procedure combined with the scale of fees was widely used in the appointment of consultants, and the Green Book maintained this position despite EU directives having come into play, whereas predominantly contractors were appointed on lowest price only, and that's by and large the practice to date. Construction contracts choices were limited to GDLA and IEI 3rd edition, both with prescribed Department of Finance amendments. Design and build was not approved of. It was at this time the NRA was embarking on its major roads programme, and clearly the Green Book was not seen as a reasonable or comprehensive approach. It's the essence of any procurement process that it recognises the reality of the economy and in particular the characteristics of the industry in framing its policy. The realities in the early 90s were that there was a serious capacity problem in terms of engineers, labour and plant. There was a serious concern that construction inflation would impact on value for money achieved, as had happened in previous spikes in infrastructure spending, where construction inflation was running at twice the domestic inflation level. There was a beginning of a reluctant recognition that Latham-type innovations in the UK were showing some benefits for all in win-win scenarios. In this context, the NRA saw great potential in both framework contracts, particularly in the appointment of consultants, and design and build as a way of increasing efficiency in the delivery of major projects. The NRA sought and received GCC permission to engage in a series of pilot projects in design and build contracts and frameworks for the appointment of consultants. This framework phase lasted about 10 years. It's important to highlight, while that there was initial universal, and by that I mean consultants, local authorities, contractors, resistance to these initiatives, the industry did engage in meaningful dialogue. In particular, the CIF engaged in great detail in the development of an acceptable model form of design and build contract based on the Scottish ATI model. This agreed form was used on the early NRA design and build projects and was seen to work exceptionally well. Post the strategic reform work of the Forum for the Construction Industry, the NRA once again engaged with the industry via the Forum working groups and developed a FIDIC-based design and build contract. This form was used in the later NRA design and build contracts. I've spent some time going through this history, one, to emphasise the context of the forms and procedures that were developed, but two, to remind all that the Department of Finance has acknowledged that PwC forms are largely based on inexperience, but the actual forms are more of Australian origin, and interestingly were never used in Australia. However, it must be remembered that the NRA procurement regime was flexible. There was genuine engagement between the industry and the NRA, and the process was modified in the light of ongoing experience. By the time the NRA contracts were adopted by the Department of Finance, the NRA was already engaging in more collaborative forms of contracts such as ECI and target price, NEC, and we had some discussions with Steve over a decade ago on that topic. And we ended up using a couple of ECI contracts before the cash ran out. A key element of the NRA policy was the encouragement of SMEs to engage. Hence, thresholds for both turnover and previous experience were set at very low levels. For example, a contractor having completed a 1 million project could, within a year, bid for a 5 million project using the 20% threshold, and having completed that could bid for a 25 million project, then 125 and so on. This liberal policy worked extremely well, and the end result is evident in the highly skilled and efficient road building industry we now have, delivering motorway projects at a rate per kilometre less than any other EU country. All it needs is projects. But the climate has changed. We still have a capacity problem, but it's that there's too little work for the available resources. A starting statistic that sticks in my mind is that over a very short period, the labour on NRA projects fell from 4,000 to 400, the equivalent of Intel closing. Wrong way again. This is an interesting quote I came across from the Advocate General on a European Court of Justice case. And I put it up in the context that efficiency must be at the core of any procurement policy. The somewhat rose-tinted view is how the courts in Luxembourg perceive public procurement. How would Ireland's construction procurement withstand this type of efficiency test? Any review of the PwC performance should factor in this type of test, but more importantly should focus on how efficiency is to be measured. Looking at the NRA history has the advantage that it was a well-defined programme of works that was delivered over a decade, that the on-time delivery, unit costs and quality of outputs can be readily measured. And the bottom line is that a high-quality road network was produced predominantly by Irish contractors on time at the lowest, as I said earlier, the lowest unit cost of any country in Europe. This in an environment where construction inflation ran at over 60% and labour rates were among the highest in Europe. The construction efficiency, design innovation and partnering aspects of the delivery were impressive. Bridges are quite a good illustration of this. If you drive the M1 built in the early 90s, every minor bridge is different and expensive. Fussy architectural detail proved inefficient when it came to widening that road. And critically, each individually designed bridge was paid on a percentage fee basis. I challenge anyone in the room to identify the vertically fluted, semi-elliptical, tapering piers that were the source of great pride in some of these bridges, but are now totally obscured by planting. Contrast this with the boring but efficient structures of the 2000 network. But these boring, invisible structures have shown great innovation in engineering design skills. As we speak, reinforced concrete beams of 40-metre span are on their way to our Cork project. Such a span would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Gap management. Have the forms worked and what's happening on the ground, or does anyone know? And from the earlier speakers, I suspect no one does know. The gap between tendered price and outturn is undoubtedly important. However, if public bodies continue to award to the lowest price, no matter how low, the consequences are obvious, and this has to be the elephant in the room. Are we looking at the right gap? From this typical glance at 10 schemes over a relatively short period, except non-scientific, the gap between tender and outturn is typically 10 to 15%, with the mean tender price, excluding highest and lowest, very close to the outturn. But the gap between highest and lowest was typically 30 to 50%. Initial anecdotal evidence on PwC would suggest that after the initial honeymoon period, the tender outturn gap is no better than illustrated, but perhaps the high-low gap is increasing. Contractors to stay in business have no option but to submit suicide bids. Current prices are so low as to be unsustainable over any length of time. Inevitably, then, either contractors go under or additional monies are paid out. And the options for additional payments at the engineer's discretion have been hugely eroded. The words reasonable and fair have virtually disappeared from the contracts. Recovery of losses is now down to expensive lawyers. The question has to be asked, does awarding work below cost constitute efficient procurement? And then I refer you back to the previous Advocate General's interpretation of efficiency and legality. Is the project being delivered to an acceptable quality at a fair price? And possibly analyse the tender spread issue as well. At the end of the day, most infrastructure projects are not leading edge technology. By and large, they are straightforward civil engineering building projects with labour, plant and material elements that can be estimated with reasonable certainty. The variance in outturn cost per kilometre of greenfield motorway projects over the 10 years was less than 10%. Why then were tender spreads up to 50%? No contractor is 50% more efficient than his competitors. Few sensible contractors would spend the significant amounts involved in tendering for a D&B project and then put forward a silly high price. Part of the success of the NRA was its ability to accurately price the job. Having looked at the UK experience in ECI target price jobs, I would have concerns that the Highway Agency at this stage has probably lost that ability, and their database is very quickly out of date and become irrelevant. And I think there's a danger of this happening here in Ireland too, as that very useful source of information, the bill of quantities, has disappeared. Disputes. Robust dispute resolution mechanism is essential to any effective management of a construction project. It's essential that disputes are resolved early. As the Chief Justice said a couple of weeks ago, delays in resolving disputes undermines confidence in the country and the economy. This is particularly true of construction disputes, where once the lawyers have engaged in discovery, the programmers have reconstructed the timescale, and the quantum experts have done their work, all with the benefit of hindsight. The dispute being argued over 2 years after the job is completed has little or nothing in common with the original dispute on the ground. Plus, it has to be borne in mind that there's a vibrant disputes industry out there willing to extract as much money over as long a period as possible from both client and contractor. That was a nice tut-tut. Plus, in the handful of NRA disputes that went to arbitration, costs would easily have exceeded the real gap between the parties at the time. Yet another gap that needs attention. The NRA, I believe, effectively introduced the concept of a standing conciliator, or DAB, into their later contracts. This gave an engineer-driven practical solution of many problems before they escalated into full-blown disputes. It effectively eliminated final account claims in that the DAB was on site every month and should be alerted to emerging issues. Hard then to convince him at the end that the month one event claimed in the final account to be of great significance did not even warrant mentioning at the monthly meetings. Unfortunately, the Department of Finance did not adopt this practice when embracing the NRA contract experience. Also worth noting in the context of the Fergal-Quinn bill going through at the moment, that the current Clause 13 conciliation is very similar to FIDIC's adjudication clause. The vast majority of NRA disputes were effectively and efficiently dealt with under these mechanisms. One of the key factors in this being successful was that the conciliator engaged early, understood the practicalities of the particular construction sector, and had the confidence of the parties. I would be concerned if the disputes phase is taken over by lawyers, probably even worse, quasi-lawyers from the disputes industry, that the confidence of the parties may well be seriously eroded. Centralised panels may be an issue here. FIDIC, as far back as 1999, introduced the concept of the DAB in their forms of contract, and possibly this is an area that would be worthwhile considering in any review of the current contracts. The issues that concern me in this really are time. Once it becomes a lawyer disputes industry driven situation, my experience would be that the 42 days allowed for conciliation evaporates. And then I'd have to ask, why, if the UK can do adjudication in 28 days, do we struggle doing conciliation in 42 days? Why is it necessary to have 42 or 45, depending on which document you read, for the parties to reject a recommendation? Centralised panels of arbitrators, adjudicators, whatever, will they have the sectoral knowledge? Will they be too remote from the actual individual jobs? And then another serious concern I would have is the lack of definitive interpretation of the contract. Will adjudication or arbitration ever get to the courts under the 2010 Act? And with a brand new form of contract, there are many clauses in that contract that need serious definitive interpretation. And until such time as the industry matures and both sides engage in constructive debate, this will be an issue. I just throw up these 4 cases to illustrate a couple of points. Waterford, I think, illustrates the necessity to have a definitive court interpretation of the contract. In that case, the interpretation of the Department of Finance amendments to Clause 67, the famous labour on charges, was the source of contention in virtually every contract at the time. This was a case dated from arbitration. And as I said earlier, has this option evaporated under the 2010 Act? And quite a number of clauses in the PwC contract cry out for this type of definitive interpretation. 10.6, 10.7, they all come to mind. The Wheel and Clare case, this was a challenge to the right of a local authority to use the restricted procedure. One man in a wheelbarrow was a memorable phrase the judge used at the time. This case went through the High Court and the Supreme Court in a matter of days and demonstrated that straightforward, definitive legal interpretation can be delivered efficiently and has the advantage of being carried forward from contract to contract, unlike the private nature of adjudication and arbitration. The SIAC case established a number of important points and is something of a landmark case in EU procurement circles. However, it's worth recalling that SIAC, with very strong European Commission support, had won the principal argument in a complaints procedure in Balbriggan some time earlier, but obviously got no money out of it. This Balbriggan complaints procedure ended up in the 96 version of conduct that people in the Water Road Service will be familiar with, outlawing likely outturn cost as an award criteria. Having won the Balbriggan case, they then fought the very similar Mayo case through the courts, High Court, Supreme Court, European Court of Justice. This battle lasted 10 years and contradicted many of the decisions arrived at in Balbriggan, and SIAC lost, so no damages. And probably gave legitimacy to the likely outturn cost as an award criteria, but it has never been used since. The final one, Uniform Limerick. The NRA had no direct involvement in this case, but it's a good example how things can escalate out of control. The end cost to the state of this project has to be multiples of the value of the project. The contractor may have won, but it was damaged beyond repair. So the only clear winners were the legals. And I'm not attacking the legals here, I just feel that engineers have to take more control of their own business. Couldn't resist sticking in a bit of Beckett. And I think, once again, only in the context of people entering into a review of the PwC, that people shouldn't feel that they've committed to it, that they have to defend it, or that they're obliged to attack it. And there have been failures on both sides. And I think the industry has changed, the economy has changed, everything has changed. It is time now to start, have a serious and mature review and see if we can do better. And I always like this quotation, and in that context I put myself forward as an expert. However, the lessons I'd like to think I've learned over the last 4 decades are that one, resolve differences early on major projects, on all projects. On major projects, the small additional cost of introducing the DAB, I believe, is well warranted. It does give the opportunity for early resolution of disputes. 2, where possible, keep engineers in control of the process. Use lawyers, experts as input, not as control over the process. And the final message would be maturity. Keep real dialogue going between government and industry with the aim of improving efficiency. And in that context, I'd say, while Clause 4 was mentioned a couple of times as reciprocal cooperation and all of that, it's not meant to define a master-slave relationship and as to how the slave should behave properly. Thank you.